Abraham Lincoln, the man who saved a nation and changed the world. Do you ever feel like your circumstances are holding you back, like you weren't born with the right advantages to succeed? Let me tell you the story of a boy who was born in a one-room log cabin with a dirt floor. He had no electricity, no running water, barely any food, and almost no formal education. He watched his mother die when he was 9 years old. He failed at business. He lost elections. He battled depression so severe that friends worried he might take his own life. But through determination, self-education, and an unshakable belief in human equality, this man became the greatest president in American history. This boy is Abraham Lincoln, a name that has become synonymous with freedom, justice, and leadership. His story is not just about becoming powerful, it's about staying true to your principles, even when the whole world is against you. It's about believing that one person can change the course of history. Today, we will walk through his incredible journey. We'll talk about his poverty-stricken childhood, his hunger for knowledge, the personal tragedies he faced, and how he led America through its darkest hour. By the time you finish this story, you'll not only know Abraham Lincoln's life, but you'll also understand that greatness can come from the most humble beginnings. And remember, as we go along, keep learning new English words and phrases, just like Lincoln taught himself to read by firelight in a log cabin. The boy from nowhere, born into poverty. Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809, in a one-room log cabin in Hardin County, Kentucky. His parents, Thomas Lincoln and Nancy Hanks Lincoln, were poor frontier farmers who could barely read or write. The cabin where Abraham was born had no windows, no floor except dirt, and one door. The family owned almost nothing. Life on the American frontier in the early 1800s was brutal. There were no stores, no doctors, no schools for miles. Families had to grow their own food, make their own clothes, and build their own shelters. If you got sick, you often died. If your crops failed, you starved. This was the world Abraham Lincoln was born into. From the earliest age, Abraham had to work. By the time he was 7 years old, he was already doing a man's work, chopping wood, planting crops, fetching water from the creek. His hands became calloused and rough. His back grew strong from endless labor. There was no time for play, no time for childhood. Survival was all that mattered. Abraham had an older sister named Sarah, who he loved dearly. The two children would play together in the rare moments when work was done, dreaming about a better life beyond the forest. But here's the thing. Even in that desperate poverty, something was different about young Abraham. His parents noticed it. His neighbors noticed it. The boy was curious about everything. He would ask endless questions. Why does the sun rise? Where do the stars come from? Why are some people slaves and others free? When Abraham was 7 years old, his family moved to Indiana, seeking better farmland. They traveled through dense wilderness, cutting their way through forests with axes. When they arrived at their new home, there was nothing there, just trees. They had to build everything from scratch. Abraham's father, Thomas, was a hardworking but uneducated man. He believed that education was a waste of time. He would say, "Book learning won't put food on the table. A man needs strong hands, not a fancy education." This attitude would create tension between father and son for years to come. In 1818, when Abraham was just 9 years old, tragedy struck. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, died from milk sickness. a disease caused by drinking milk from cows that had eaten poisonous white snakeroot plants. Abraham watched his mother suffer and die in their tiny cabin. There was no doctor, no medicine, nothing that could save her. Abraham and his father built Nancy's coffin from rough wooden planks. They buried her on a hill near their cabin. Standing at his mother's grave, 9-year-old Abraham felt a darkness descend on him that would never fully lift. Years later, he would say, "All that I am, or hope to be, I owe to my angel mother." For over a year, Abraham, his sister Sarah, and his father lived alone in the cabin. It was a miserable existence. The cabin was filthy, there was barely any food. Abraham later described this period as the loneliest time of his life. Then something wonderful happened. Thomas Lincoln traveled back to Kentucky and returned with a new wife, Sarah Bush Johnston, a widow with 3 children of her own. Sarah brought furniture, dishes, and most importantly, books. She also brought something else, kindness and love. Sarah Bush Lincoln immediately saw something special in Abraham. While his father dismissed his love of reading, Sarah encouraged it. She would say, "Abe's going to be something someday, mark my words." She treated Abraham like her own son, and he loved her for it. He would later call her my best friend in this world. The hunger for knowledge, teaching himself everything. In frontier Indiana, there were no schools nearby. Abraham attended school for only a few weeks here and there whenever a traveling teacher happened to pass through the area. In total, Abraham Lincoln had less than 1 year of formal education in his entire life. Less than 1 year. Think about that. But Abraham was determined to educate himself. He would walk miles to borrow a book from a neighbor. He read every book he could get his hands on: the Bible, Aesop's Fables, Robinson Crusoe, Pilgrim's Progress, and biographies of George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. At night, after a long day of brutal physical labor, Abraham would lie by the fireplace and read by the flickering light. His father would yell at him, "Put down that book and get to work." But Abraham couldn't stop. Books were his escape from poverty, his window to a bigger world, his path to something better. Abraham didn't just read, he studied. He would copy passages from books onto wooden boards with charcoal because paper was too expensive. He would read the same book multiple times, memorizing entire passages. He taught himself grammar, mathematics, and law. He became a master of the English language through nothing but determination and endless practice. His stepmother, Sarah, later recalled, "Abe would sit up late at night reading by the fire. Sometimes I'd wake up at midnight and he'd still be there, his face glowing in the firelight, lost in a book." By the time Abraham was a teenager, he had become known in the community for 2 things: his physical strength and his intelligence. He was 6 feet 4 inches tall, incredibly strong, and could split more logs than any man in the county. But he could also recite poetry, tell stories, and debate ideas with remarkable skill. Abraham also developed a reputation as a storyteller. He would gather people around and tell jokes and stories that had them roaring with laughter. This ability to connect with people through stories would later become one of his greatest strengths as a politician. But life remained hard. In 1828, when Abraham was 19 years old, his beloved sister Sarah died during childbirth. She was only 21 years old. Abraham was devastated. First his mother, now his sister. The 2 people he loved most in the world, gone. Standing at Sarah's grave, Abraham felt that familiar darkness creeping back. He later said, "There is no greater sorrow than losing someone who believed in you." Breaking free, the journey to independence. In 1830, when Abraham was 21 years old, his family moved again, this time to Illinois. Abraham helped his father build a new cabin and clear new land,
But Abraham had made a decision. This would be the last time he would work for his father. He was going to make his own way in the world. In 1831, Abraham left home for good. He was 22 years old, penniless, with no formal education and no clear plan. But he had something more valuable: determination and an unwavering belief that he could be more than a poor farmer. Abraham moved to New Salem, Illinois, a small frontier village on the Sangamon River. He took a job as a clerk in a general store. The pay was terrible, but it gave him something his farm life never had: time to read and time to meet people. In New Salem, Abraham quickly became popular. He was honest, hardworking, and funny. People loved his stories and his common sense. He joined a debating society where he learned to argue and persuade. He began to think about politics. But here's what most people don't know. Abraham's early adult life was full of failure and struggle. In 1832, he tried to start his own general store with a partner. The business failed completely, leaving Abraham deeply in debt. He would spend the next 15 years paying off what he called the national debt. He was so poor that he had to sell his horse and his surveying equipment to pay his creditors. Abraham later joked, "I was the most poverty-stricken man I ever knew." But he never declared bankruptcy. He believed in honoring his debts no matter how long it took. This honesty earned him the nickname Honest Abe, a reputation that would follow him throughout his life. During this difficult time, Abraham also served briefly in the Black Hawk War, a conflict between the United States and Native American tribes. He was elected captain of his volunteer company, which he later said was the greatest honor of his life up to that point. But he never saw combat, and he joked that his only battles were with mosquitoes. After his store failed, Abraham needed work. He became a surveyor, measuring and mapping land. This job took him all over the countryside, where he met people from all walks of life. He learned about their struggles, their hopes, their dreams. This experience taught him to understand and connect with ordinary people. But Abraham wanted more. In 1832, at age 23, he ran for the Illinois state legislature. He lost. It was his first political defeat, but it wouldn't be his last. Not discouraged, Abraham continued educating himself. He borrowed law books and began studying law on his own. He would walk 20 miles to the county courthouse just to watch trials and learn from experienced lawyers. He taught himself legal principles, court procedures, and the art of argumentation. In 1834, Abraham ran for the state legislature again. This time, he won. He was 25 years old, a self-taught lawyer with barely any formal education, now serving in the government. It was the beginning of his political career. Becoming a lawyer, the power of self-education. While serving in the legislature, Abraham continued studying law. In 1836, he passed the bar exam and became a licensed attorney. Think about this. A man with less than 1 year of formal schooling had taught himself law well enough to become a lawyer. This is one of the most remarkable examples of self-education in American history.
Abraham moved to Springfield, Illinois, the state capital, and joined a law firm. He quickly gained a reputation as an excellent lawyer. He was especially good in jury trials because he could explain complex legal ideas in simple language that ordinary people understood. He once said, "If you can't explain something simply, you don't understand it well enough." Abraham took all kinds of cases: property disputes, criminal trials, business contracts. He traveled across Illinois on horseback, going from courthouse to courthouse, arguing cases. He earned a modest living, but more importantly, he gained experience in persuasion, logic, and understanding human nature. But Abraham's personal life was complicated. He was awkward around women, tall and gangly with a high-pitched voice. He didn't know how to dance or engage in small talk. Several romantic relationships ended badly, leaving him heartbroken. In 1840, Abraham met Mary Todd, a young woman from a wealthy Kentucky family. Mary was educated, cultured, and ambitious.
She was drawn to Abraham's intelligence and political potential. Abraham was attracted to her wit and refinement. But their courtship was rocky. They became engaged, but then Abraham broke it off in 1841, sending Mary a letter ending their engagement. Abraham fell into a deep depression, what he called the hypochondria. He was so depressed that his friends worried he might commit suicide. He wrote, "I am now the most miserable man living. If what I feel were equally distributed to the whole human family, there would not be one cheerful face on earth." This is a crucial part of Lincoln's story that often gets overlooked. He battled severe depression throughout his life. The darkness that descended when his mother died never fully went away. He would have periods of deep melancholy where he could barely function. But here's what made Abraham extraordinary. He didn't let his depression stop him. He learned to function despite it, to push through the darkness and keep working toward his goals. He once said, "I laugh because I must not cry." In 1842, Abraham and Mary reconciled and got married. It was not a perfect marriage. They had very different temperaments and often clashed, but they also shared ambition and eventually had 4 sons: Robert, Edward, William, and Thomas, nicknamed Tad. Tragedy would strike their family repeatedly. Their second son, Edward, died at age 3 in 1850. Abraham was devastated. He held his son's body and wept openly, something men rarely did in that era. The loss deepened his melancholy, but also strengthened his empathy for others who suffered. Rising in politics, finding his voice. Throughout the 1840s, Abraham practiced law and dabbled in politics. He served 1 term in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1847 to 1849, but he wasn't particularly effective. He returned to Springfield thinking his political career was over. But then something happened that changed everything. In 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed new territories to decide for themselves whether to permit slavery. This infuriated Abraham. He believed slavery was morally wrong and that the nation's founders had intended for it to eventually die out. This issue reignited Abraham's political passion. He began speaking out against slavery expansion with a power and eloquence that surprised everyone who knew him. He wasn't an abolitionist demanding immediate emancipation, but he believed slavery was a moral evil that should not spread to new territories. In 1858, Abraham ran for the U.S. Senate against Stephen Douglas, one of the most powerful politicians in America. The campaign featured a series of 7 debates that became legendary. These Lincoln-Douglas debates drew thousands of people and were reported in newspapers across the country. Abraham argued that slavery was morally wrong and should not be allowed to expand. He said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand, and I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free." This was a radical statement at the time. Stephen Douglas was a skilled debater, but Abraham held his own. His arguments were logical, his language was beautiful, and his moral conviction was undeniable. People who heard him speak said they felt like they were witnessing something historic. But here's the thing. Abraham lost the election. Stephen Douglas won the Senate seat. It was another defeat, another failure. Abraham was 49 years old, and his political career seemed finished. However, the debates had made him famous nationally. People across the country now knew the name Abraham Lincoln. They had read his speeches and been moved by his words. He had lost the battle, but won something more valuable: national recognition. The impossible dream: running for president. In 1860, the Republican Party was looking for a presidential candidate. The party was new, formed specifically to oppose slavery's expansion. They needed someone who was anti-slavery but not too radical, someone who could win votes in both the North and the border states. Abraham Lincoln seemed like an unlikely choice. He had served only 1 term in Congress. He had lost his last major election. He had no experience as executive. He came from poverty. He barely had any formal education. On paper, he was completely unqualified to be president. But Abraham had something the other candidates didn't. He had the common touch. He understood ordinary people because he was one of them. He could communicate complex ideas simply, and his opposition to slavery was principled but pragmatic. At the Republican National Convention in Chicago, Abraham was nominated on the third ballot. The nomination shocked political insiders. How could this backwoods lawyer become president? The 1860 campaign was chaotic. The Democratic Party split into northern and southern factions, each nominating their own candidate. A fourth candidate represented those trying to avoid the slavery issue altogether. Abraham ran on a platform of stopping slavery's expansion into new territories but not interfering with it where it already existed. He promised to preserve the Union above all else. He barely campaigned, instead staying in Springfield and letting his supporters speak for him.
On November 6, 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected the 16th President of the United States. He won without carrying a single Southern state. In fact, his name wasn't even on the ballot in most Southern states. Can you imagine a man born in a log cabin with a dirt floor, who taught himself to read by firelight, who failed in business and lost elections, was now going to be President of the United States? It's one of the most remarkable rises in political history. But his victory came with a terrible price. The South saw Lincoln's election as a threat to their way of life. Before he even took office, Southern states began seceding from the Union. The nation tears apart. The Civil War begins. Between Lincoln's election in November 1860 and his inauguration in March 1861, 7 Southern states seceded and formed the Confederate States of America. They elected their own president, Jefferson Davis, and prepared for war. When Abraham Lincoln took the oath of office on March 4, 1861, the nation was falling apart. In his inaugural address, he tried to reassure the South that he wouldn't interfere with slavery where it existed, but he was firm. Secession was illegal, and he would preserve the Union. He said, "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection." These beautiful words fell on deaf ears. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter, a federal fort in South Carolina. The Civil War had begun. 4 more states joined the Confederacy. The Union was broken. Abraham now faced the greatest crisis in American history. The country he had just been elected to lead was tearing itself apart. He had to make impossible decisions. How do you fight a war against your own countrymen? How do you preserve the Union without becoming a tyrant? How do you end slavery without losing the border states? Here's what most people don't understand about Lincoln during the Civil War. He had no military experience. He had never commanded troops in battle. But he had to become commander-in-chief of the entire Union Army. He spent countless hours studying military strategy, poring over maps, and learning the art of war. The first years of the war were disasters for the Union. Lincoln appointed generals who failed him again and again. The Confederate Army won victory after victory. Northerners began to turn against the war, demanding peace even if it meant letting the South go. Abraham faced criticism from all sides. Abolitionists said he wasn't doing enough to free the slaves. Democrats said he was a tyrant who had violated the Constitution. His own generals questioned his leadership. Newspapers mocked him, calling him names and printing cruel cartoons. The stress was unimaginable. Abraham aged dramatically during his first 2 years in office. His face became gaunt, lined with deep wrinkles. He suffered from terrible headaches and insomnia. He would pace the halls of the White House at night, unable to sleep, the weight of hundreds of thousands of deaths on his shoulders. But here's what made Lincoln great. He never gave up. He never stopped looking for the right general, the right strategy,
the right words to keep the nation together. He once said, "I do the very best I know how, the very best I can, and I mean to keep on doing so until the end." The emancipation, changing the purpose of the war. In the summer of 1862, Abraham made a decision that would change everything. He decided to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all slaves in Confederate states would be free. This was an incredibly risky decision. The border states, slave states that stayed in the Union, might secede. Northern voters who supported the war to preserve the Union, but not to free the slaves, might turn against him. It could cost him the next election. But Abraham had come to believe that the war could never truly end while slavery existed. He said, "In giving freedom to the slave, we assure freedom to the free." He also believed it was morally right. He had always hated slavery, and now he had the power to strike against it. On January 1, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect. It didn't free all slaves immediately. It only applied to Confederate states, which were in rebellion. But it changed the fundamental nature of the war. Now the Union was fighting not just to preserve itself, but to end slavery. The proclamation also allowed black men to join the Union Army. Nearly 200,000 black soldiers would serve, fighting for their own freedom and the freedom of their people. Lincoln later said these troops made the difference between victory and defeat. But the war dragged on. The death toll mounted horrifically. Battles like Gettysburg, Antietam, and Shiloh killed tens of thousands of men in single days. The nation was drowning in blood. In November 1863, Abraham traveled to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, to dedicate a cemetery for the thousands of soldiers who had died there. He was not the main speaker. That honor went to Edward Everett, a famous orator who spoke for 2 hours. Then, Abraham stood up and delivered what became the most famous speech in American history. The Gettysburg Address lasted just 2 minutes and was only 276 words long, but those words redefined America. He said, "407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth." These words transformed the war from a fight to preserve the Union into a fight for human equality and democracy itself. It's considered one of the greatest speeches ever given. Personal tragedy, when darkness came home. While Abraham was leading the nation through its darkest hour, tragedy struck his own family. In February 1862, his 11-year-old son, Willie, died of typhoid fever in the White House. Abraham was absolutely devastated. He threw himself on Willie's bed and sobbed uncontrollably. For weeks after Willie's death, Abraham would lock himself in the room where his son had died and weep. His secretary found him there one day and heard him say, "My poor boy, he was too good for this earth." His wife Mary was so overcome with grief that she became mentally unstable. She would scream and cry for hours. Abraham would hold her and say, "Mother, you must control yourself, or they will take you away from me." This personal tragedy, combined with the weight of the war, nearly broke Lincoln. But somehow he found the strength to continue. He channeled his grief into empathy for the thousands of other parents who had lost sons in the war. He began writing personal letters to families who had lost loved ones. One famous letter was to a widow, Mrs. Bixby, who had lost 5 sons in battle, though later research suggests it may have been 2, not 5. Lincoln wrote,
I feel how weak and fruitless must be any words of mine which should attempt to beguile you from the grief of a loss so overwhelming. These acts of compassion, even while he was drowning in his own sorrow, showed Lincoln's profound humanity. Finding the right general, the tide turns. For 3 years, Lincoln struggled to find a general who could win the war. He appointed general after general: McClellan, Burnside, Hooker, Meade. Each one disappointed him. Then, in 1864, he promoted Ulysses S. Grant to command all Union armies. Grant was different from the others. He was a fighter who understood that the Union's advantage was in numbers and resources. He would grind down the Confederacy through relentless pressure. Grant's strategy was brutal and bloody, but it worked. Slowly, the Union began winning. Sherman marched through Georgia, destroying everything in his path. Grant besieged Lee's army in Virginia. But 1864 was also an election year, and Lincoln's re-election was far from certain. The war had dragged on for 3 years. Hundreds of thousands were dead. Many Northerners wanted peace, even if it meant letting the South go. Lincoln ran against George McClellan, his former general, who promised to negotiate peace with the Confederacy. Lincoln believed that if he lost, everything they had fought for would be lost. Slavery would continue, the Union would be permanently divided. Lincoln was so certain he would lose that he wrote a memo predicting his defeat. But then, in September 1864, Sherman captured Atlanta. This military victory changed everything. Suddenly, victory seemed possible. On November 8, 1864, Abraham Lincoln was re-elected. He won decisively, carrying every state except 3. The people had voted to continue the fight until slavery was ended and the Union restored. In his second inaugural address in March 1865, with victory finally in sight, Lincoln delivered another masterpiece of American oratory. Instead of celebrating victory or condemning the South, he called for healing and reconciliation. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. This was Lincoln at his finest, generous in victory, focused on healing rather than revenge, determined to reunite the broken nation. Victory and assassination, the cruelest fate. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered the Confederate Army at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. The Civil War was over. The Union had won. Slavery would end. Abraham Lincoln had done it. Against all odds, he had preserved the nation and ended slavery. He had taken a country torn apart by hatred and was preparing to bind it back together with compassion and forgiveness. For the first time in 4 years, Lincoln seemed happy. He smiled more. He made plans for the future. He talked about visiting the Holy Land after his presidency. He looked forward to returning to Springfield and practicing law again. On April 14, 1865, just 5 days after Lee's surrender, Abraham and Mary decided to go see a play at Ford's Theater in Washington. The play was a comedy called Our American Cousin. Lincoln wanted to laugh, to celebrate, to enjoy a rare moment of peace. John Wilkes Booth, a famous actor and Confederate sympathizer, had been planning to kidnap Lincoln for months. When he learned that Lincoln would be at the theater that night, he changed his plan to assassination. During the third act of the play, Booth entered the presidential box behind Lincoln. He pulled out a pistol and shot Abraham Lincoln in the back of the head. The president slumped forward, unconscious. Booth jumped from the box onto the stage, breaking his leg in the process. He shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," Latin for "thus always to tyrants," and escaped through the back door. Lincoln was carried across the street to a boarding house,
where doctors examined him. The bullet had entered his brain. There was no hope. For 9 hours, Abraham Lincoln lay dying, surrounded by cabinet members and friends. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died. He was 56 years old. Secretary of War Adander Stanton said, "Now he belongs to the ages."
The entire nation was plunged into mourning. People who had criticized Lincoln harshly just weeks before now wept openly in the streets. They realized what they had lost. The man who had saved the Union, freed the slaves, and had the wisdom and compassion to heal the nation's wounds. His body was placed on a funeral train that traveled from Washington to Springfield, Illinois, retracing the route he had taken to his inauguration. In every city and town, thousands of people lined the tracks to say goodbye. It was the largest outpouring of grief in American history up to that time. The legacy: why Lincoln still matters. Abraham Lincoln's assassination turned him from a president into a martyr, from a leader into a legend. But his legacy isn't just about how he died, it's about how he lived and what he accomplished. Here's what Lincoln achieved. 1. He preserved the United States. Without Lincoln's leadership, the nation would have split into 2 countries, and the democratic experiment that began in 1776 would have failed. His determination to preserve the Union, no matter the cost, kept America whole. 2. He ended slavery. Lincoln pushed through the 13th Amendment, which permanently abolished slavery in the United States. 4 million people were freed. This was the most significant expansion of human freedom in American history. 3. He redefined American democracy. Through speeches like the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln transformed America's understanding of itself. We became a nation dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, committed to government of the people, by the people, for the people. 4. He showed that leadership requires moral courage. Lincoln made unpopular decisions because he believed they were right. He was willing to lose elections, face criticism, and endure personal attacks to do what he thought was morally necessary. 5. He demonstrated that humble origins don't limit potential. Lincoln rose from poverty and self-education to become the greatest president in American history. His life proves that in America, anyone can rise to greatness through determination and hard work. The numbers behind the leader. Let's talk about Lincoln's impact in concrete terms. The human cost. The Civil War killed approximately 620,000 soldiers and countless civilians. It was the deadliest war in American history. Every decision Lincoln made carried this terrible weight. Emancipation. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment freed approximately 4 million enslaved people, ending an institution that had existed in America for over 200 years. Preservation. Lincoln kept 23 states in the Union while fighting against 11 Confederate states. He prevented the nation from splitting permanently. Words that last. Lincoln gave over 150 speeches as president. His Gettysburg Address, 272 words, second inaugural address, 701 words, and countless other speeches are still studied and quoted today. Economic transformation. During the war, Lincoln signed the Homestead Act, giving free land to settlers, the Pacific Railway Act, building the Transcontinental Railroad, and the National Banking Act, creating a national currency. These laws transformed America's economy. The wisdom of Lincoln, his most powerful words. Throughout his life, Abraham Lincoln shared wisdom that still resonates today. On perseverance. I am a slow walker, but I never walk back. On ambition. Always bear in mind that your own resolution to succeed is more important than any other. On character.
Nearly all men can stand adversity, but if you want to test a man's character, give him power. On learning, the things I want to know are in books. My best friend is the man who'll get me a book I ain't read. On change, the dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. We must think anew and act anew. On equality, as I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. This expresses my idea of democracy. On kindness, I have always found that mercy bears richer fruits than strict justice. On life's challenges, that some achieve great success is proof to all that others can achieve it as well. These quotes reveal a man who was deeply thoughtful, principled, and humane, a man who understood human nature and believed in human potential. The man behind the monument, understanding the real Lincoln. It's easy to see Abraham Lincoln as a marble statue, a perfect hero without flaws. But the real Lincoln was far more complex, and in some ways more inspiring because of his flaws. Lincoln struggled with depression his entire life. He had periods of deep melancholy where he could barely function. His law partner said Lincoln was the saddest man he ever knew. But he learned to work through his depression, to function despite it, and even to use it to deepen his empathy for others who suffered. Lincoln was not a perfect husband. His marriage to Mary was difficult. They argued frequently and had very different personalities, but they also shared genuine affection and supported each other through terrible tragedies. Lincoln was not an immediate abolitionist. Early in his career, he was more concerned with stopping slavery's expansion than with immediate emancipation. He evolved on this issue over time. This shows us that it's okay to change your views as you learn and grow. Lincoln made mistakes as president. Some of his generals were terrible choices. He suspended habeas corpus, the right not to be imprisoned without trial, which many considered unconstitutional. He wasn't perfect, but he learned from his mistakes and kept trying to do better.
What made Lincoln truly great wasn't perfection. It was his capacity for growth, his willingness to learn, his empathy for others, and his unwavering commitment to doing what he believed was right, even when it was difficult. The modern relevance. What Lincoln teaches us today. You might wonder, why does a president from 160 years ago still matter? What can Abraham Lincoln teach us in the 21st century? The answer is everything. Lincoln's life offers timeless lessons. Education is empowerment. Lincoln had less than 1 year of formal schooling, but became one of the most eloquent writers and speakers in American history. He proves that education isn't about where you go to school. It's about your determination to learn. Your background doesn't determine your future. Lincoln was born in extreme poverty with no advantages. He became president. Your circumstances are not your destiny. Moral courage matters. Lincoln was willing to lose elections, face harsh criticism, and endure personal attacks to do what he believed was right, even when it was difficult. In our age of social media mobs and cancel culture, his example of principled leadership is more relevant than ever. Empathy makes great leaders. Lincoln's ability to understand and forgive his enemies, to see situations from others' perspectives, made him an effective leader. In our polarized times, we desperately need Lincoln's spirit of malice toward none, charity for all. Perseverance overcomes failure. Lincoln failed in business, lost elections, battled depression, and faced constant setbacks, but he never gave up. His life teaches us that failure is not final unless we choose to stop trying. Words have power. Lincoln used language to inspire, unite, and transform.
In an age of tweets and sound bites, his careful, thoughtful, beautiful use of language reminds us that how we communicate matters. The unfinished work, Lincoln's challenge to us. In the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln spoke of the unfinished work that those who died had begun. He challenged the living to complete that work, to ensure that these dead shall not have died in vain. More than 160 years later, that work is still unfinished. Lincoln freed the slaves, but equality remains elusive. He preserved the Union, but divisions still threaten our society. He called for malice toward none, but hatred still poisons our politics. Lincoln's challenge to us is clear. We must continue the work he began. We must fight for equality, not just in law, but in reality. We must preserve democracy, not just as a system, but as a living ideal. We must treat each other with respect and empathy, even when we disagree. Lincoln once said, "I am not bound to win, but I am bound to be true. I am not bound to succeed, but I am bound to live up to what light I have." This is his challenge to each of us, to live up to the light we have, to do what we believe is right, even when it's difficult, to keep working toward a more perfect union. The unfinished work is ours to complete. Will we accept Lincoln's challenge?